Today is March 18th. I'll call the Green Mountain Care Board's hearing to order. We have three substantive agenda items. The first is a discussion and potential vote relating to the QHP standard plan design proposals. We then have a presentation by our Health Systems Finance team on fiscal year 25 hospital budget actuals. And then we've noticed a potential executive session to discuss UVM Health Network's objections to a proposed benchmark. So I'll start with the QHP standard plan design. I'm going to abstain from voting since I did not attend the hearing, and I was unable to watch the hearing between when it happened and today, but I'd like the vote to go forward if possible. So I'll open up to any other board member discussion or comment on the plan design, and if there is no other comment, I will leave it to a board member to make the motion.
Oh, and I did have a couple additional pieces of information that I thought were coming from questions we had last week. I don't know if you wanted me to do that kind of before or after, or how we wanted to address those.
Thank you for raising that. Yes, please, before would be great, Darren.
Perfect. I will go ahead and share my screen then. Yeah, so we had a lot of good questions after the presentation last week, and I just wanted to add a little more detail to some of those questions that we got. So as always, I have my usual premium impact caveat slide here that, I'll have some premium impact metrics in the next couple slides, and that's kind of based on Wakely's modeling. We're only modeling the piece of premium impact coming from plan benefit design. Obviously trends and morbidity trends, and there will be other things addressing premium impacts. This is our own model. It's not the carrier models. But I think it speaks to kind of the trade-offs between benefits and premiums inherent in plan design discussions. So the first question I wanted to address was on the trend we used in these premium impact calculations, and how that compared to the trend that was used in the federal actuarial value calculator, just to understand the dynamics there. So this top portion I noted last week was the 26 to 27 trend used in the AV calculator was quite high, the highest it has been in that at 6.7% for medical and 10.7% for pharmacy. I added a little detail down below as to the trend we use in our premium impact calculations. So when comparing premium impact from last year's plans to this year's plans, we kind of look at last year's plans on last year's basis, so 2026, and then we say, okay, for 2027, the same plan design is going to be on a higher level of cost, so that will make it a richer plan design, even if all deductibles and MOOPs and cost sharing is kept the same. And we pull that trend typically from the most recent kind of Vermont specific unified rate review template tools, and use just like a weighted average of trend between the two issuers, and that's what we roll forwards into our premium impact calculations. So we determined for the year two trends, this would have been the 25 to 26 trend, was 4.6% for medical and 14.9% for pharmacy, which averaged out to about 6.6% for total trend. So it's actually a little lower than the AVC. The pharmacy number jumps off the page a little bit, but after you weight by medical and pharmacy spend, it's a little lower than the AVC trend, and that was the number we used for 26 to 27 as well. So that was that question. The other one we had got was on the impact of the free primary care or mental health and substance use disorder office visits. 3 free visits before the copay or before deductible coinsurance, and what the impact of those visits was on the premium. So a lot of numbers on this slide. I'll try to walk through them. So the 2 bold rows are for the plans we modeled. So the gold deductible plan, and then the bronze without pharmacy limit plan. This was kind of the status quo with our primary options, was a slight premium impact decrease for the gold plan, and then a somewhat substantial premium decrease for the bronze without pharmacy limit plan. That plan had a fairly high deductible and MOOP increase because the stakeholder group feedback was that it was good to have that plan kind of focus more on limiting premium based on the the policyholders who were selecting it. So for each plan, we then did kind of 2 additional models. So the first one was, what if we did, instead of a pool of visits that could be applied to mental health and substance use disorder office visits or PCP, what if it was just PCP and then removing all the visits entirely? And the math's a little different in terms of total impact, but the proportions are pretty similar. If we drop down to the PCP visits only, we get about $9 cheaper on a PMPY basis, $15 cheaper on a PMPY basis for the bronze plan. And then dropping down to no free visits period gets you like 2/3 of the remaining impact. So the mental health and substance use disorder visits, typically people who use those visits use more in a year, so they're more likely to kind of use all 3, but it's a smaller proportion of the population that uses them. So that's really the PCP visits are about 2/3 of the impact, taking you all the way, $27 additionally, as opposed to the $9. On a PMPM basis, it's a pretty small benefit. It's not driving a huge portion of premium, certainly having those 3 free visits. But that's kind of how it breaks down between the 2 options. Those are the only 2 questions I kind of had that needed a little analytical follow-up. Happy to take any additional questions before the vote.
This is Sarah. I have a question because this was what I was asking about. I appreciate you doing this work for me. And it's helpful to see. I wouldn't make a change without knowing how many members would be impacted on these plans, or recommend anything like that. My only other question was, if we had applied it to the deductible, could we have prevented the 10,000, the increase from the 10,000 whatever to the 12,000 in the deductible on these plans? And I should have asked that before, but just.
Yeah, let me go. In that plan, it was not. Apologies as I scrolled very quickly through my slide deck from last week. So that would have been the bronze deductible without pharmacy limit.
Right. That was what you modeled, right?
Correct. Yeah. So this was a plan where our preferred option was more of an increase in cost sharing than is required by statute. This was one of only like 2 plans where that was really the case. Like most plans, we had to make pretty substantial changes. We had a backup option where we increased just to 11,100. That was still under the limit. The stakeholder group felt it was worth going all the way up to the $12,000 deductible and MOOP, which is the limit, as high as you can set that for 2027. First off, because that plan has frequently been at that limit, so that's been pretty normal. And then secondly, because the feedback we received was that people in this plan very rarely hit their out-of-pocket max. The people selecting this plan seem to be typically doing so on the basis of wanting, some level of coverage at the lowest premium they can get, or even a $0 premium depending on subsidies. So the stakeholder group felt it was worth focusing on minimizing the premium over anything around benefits. So that was kind of the stakeholder group's thoughts on the bronze plan.
Great. I don't have any more questions. I really appreciate you looking deeper into this and explaining the thought process in your decision making.
No problem. Thank you.
Any other board member questions at this time for Darren or Peter? Would any board member like to make a motion relating to the plan designs?
I can make a motion, Chair Foster. I move to approve DVHA's recommended plan designs for the plan year 2027 standard qualified health plans, including the non-minor changes requiring board approval. These non-minor changes are in the bronze deductible plan without pharmacy limit, with the medical deductible and out-of-pocket maximum each increasing to $12,000, and the bronze high deductible health plan where the medical deductible will increase to $6,300.
I'll second the motion.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And the vote carries with 4 members supporting and 1 abstaining. I'm sorry, I totally botched that. Sorry, I'm off my procedure this morning. I needed to take public comment before the vote. I think this is the first time I've had a vote where I didn't make the motion and call for, so I apologize. So there has been a second. Let's back up. There's been a second, and let me hear if there's any other board member discussion. I'm going to presume no, since everyone already voted, but if anyone does have any, please let me know. Okay, is there any comment from the healthcare advocate? Sorry, Eric, you're
No,
muted.
yeah, no comment from us, Chair.
Okay, great, thank you. And any public comment? Okay, and now I'll take the vote. All in favor of Member Holmes's motion and Ms. Teachat's second, please say aye.
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 And the motion carries 4 votes in support. Thank you all very much, and I'm glad my error was harmless. Thank you, Darren and Peter. We appreciate your work on this. And the next agenda item is we will have a review of the fiscal year 25 hospital actuals from Mr. Sutter and the Health Systems Finance team.
Thank you, Chair Foster. Give me a moment to get the slides up. They might take a little bit longer. They're quite lengthy. That was quicker than I thought. All right. Thank you, everybody. So today we're just going to review the FY25 operating results from the hospitals, and we'll go through it, analyze it from system level, and then go through each individual hospital. And I will start us off. So starting with the summary income statement for the system, and we're going to be pretty quick. There's I think almost 100 slides here, so we're going to go through them fairly quickly just for the sake of everyone's time, but. They'll be posted on the website here after the meeting for additional review. So starting with a summary income statement for the system, just to orient folks, we'll be looking at another 14 of these. So from left to right, the columns, we're showing FY23 actuals, FY24 actuals, FY25 budget, and then the FY25 actuals, then variance against budget. And then we're also showing the actual growth over the last 3 years. So system-wide, hospitals generated roughly $55 million in income last year, which is about in line with FY24, but well below the $96 million that were budgeted. I do want to mention, and you'll hear this repeatedly through the presentation, more concerning though is about $37 million that operating margin or income is due to employee retention credits they've received, which are effectively could be thought of as like one-time dollars in nature. Here we're looking at variance over time for NPR, total operating revenue, and operating expenses. So I'll just walk through the graph very quickly, but the red line reflects total operating revenue, and the solid line reflects their actuals. The dotted line is their budget, and then the percentage above the solid line reflects the variance for that measure against budget. So for here, you can see their total operating revenue budget or actuals came in at 3.9% over budget in 25. Versus their expenses coming in 4.9% over budget. And then NPR coming in at 1.5% over budget. I'll note that the budget to actual NPR variance in FY25 was the lowest it's been since FY19, but you can see some larger and in some cases growing variances in the total operating revenue and expenses. Looking at growth over time, different types of hospitals have had different experiences. So splitting it up according to critical access hospitals, mid-sized community hospitals, and the academic medical center, similarly to how we review peer groups in the hospital budget review process, you can kind of see the experience here for NPR being different. So Just going through the numbers quickly, from FY17 to 25, the net patient care revenue at critical access hospitals grew at an average annual rate of 5.2%, compared to 4.8% at the mid-sized community hospitals and 6.1% at the academic medical center. In this graph, we also included FY26 budget in here, which the last point reflects. So you can see kind of the impact of some budget decisions made last year on the compound growth over time. Here we're showing just total operating revenue and operating expenses. Again, kind of a similar experience with the academic medical center growing faster in both than the other types of hospitals in the system. But again, 7.9% growth in total operating revenue, 8.5% in operating expenses at the academic medical center, 5.5% growth in revenue at the critical access hospitals compared to 5.2% OpEx growth, and then 5.2% operating revenue growth at the mid-size hospital versus 5.1% expense growth. I did want to look at operating revenue excluding pharmacy. So you'll notice there's a difference between the growth in NPR FEP and total operating revenue. And what's driving that is what we refer to as like other operating revenue. And a large and significant and growing component of that for some of our larger hospitals is the specialty pharmacy revenue, 340B retail, and outpatient pharmacy revenue. So after we back out those revenues, the growth disparity between the AMC and other types of hospitals is smaller, but it's still existent. So from FY17 to 25, the AMC's average about a 6.3% annual growth compared to 5.5 at the critical access hospitals and 4.9 at the mid-size hospitals. The system average, excluding UVM, was about 5.1%. So had UVM's and total non-pharmacy operating revenue grown at that rate, that 5.1%, than 6.3%, again, compounded since FY17, it would have meant approximately $176 million in less reduced revenue for FY25. So I just want to provide some sense of scale, because these percentages look like there are small differences in them, but compounded over time, they do drive some large disparities in the system. This slide is looking at the concentration of revenue from different payers by hospital type. So to help interpret, we'll just look at the first table here. So for commercial revenue, of 100% of the total commercial revenue received in FY25, critical access hospitals received 16.4% of it, mid-size hospitals 28%, and the academic medical center 55.5%. So we saw the overall concentration of commercial patient care revenue, a slight shift from the mid-size hospitals to the AMCs and the critical access hospitals. We see a larger shift in the concentration of Medicare revenue from the AMC and critical access hospitals to the mid-size community hospitals. And then in Medicaid, we see a similar shift from the mid-size hospitals to the AMC and critical access hospitals. Again, here we're looking at a waterfall graph, kind of just graphing the system operating income. So system-wide, like I mentioned before, Vermont Hospital generated nearly $55 million in operating income, again, against a budgeted $96 million. But 98% of that you'll see is from Rutland and UVM. And then on top of that, right, there's that employee retention credit that's sort of inflating the system-wide increase here, or operating income here. So even in UVM, and we'll discuss these more, the employee retention credit on the individual hospital slides, but even here, right, so UVM's showing a $32 million operating income. That's inflated by, and we'll have the exact number on the slide, but I think about $12 million in employee retention credits there. So not quite as, the margin is not quite as large as it might appear, but for that retention credit. We're gonna go through a few different metrics. We're gonna look at operating margin, days cash on hand, accounts receivable, and their current ratios for all these hospitals. We'll speak to these metrics on the individual slides, but we wanted to show them system-wide and all group here for comparability purposes. But margin for the system, you'll see, was 1.3%. This was in line with last year, but well below budget, and then again inflated by employee retention credit. System days cash on hand was very similar to last year, but the individual hospital experiences have differed. We'll kind of discuss that more on the individual hospital slides, but we're looking at about 141. And then similar story with days accounts receivable, a small uptick from last year, but kind of in line with what we've seen historically from the hospitals. I do want to flag, and we'll mention it here very shortly. You see Brattleboro's figures are very concerning, 132 days. Obviously, they have their issues they're working out up there, so not unexpected that it would rise a little bit, but again, very concerning, those figures. And then Springfield's also is quite high at 78. Oh, I will note, and we'll mention again when we get to them, but you'll see Giffords has actually improved quite a bit from 24. They were running very hot at 73 days and accounts receivable, back down to about the system average, just slightly over at 51. So a pretty good improvement there. And then current ratio is kind of in line with what we've seen over the last several years. So no major shifts there outside of some individual hospitals. So jumping into the individual hospitals, let's go in alphabetical order. I'll start with Brattleboro, and then I'll run through a number of these and then pass it over to my colleague to take over some of the other hospitals. So BMH came in slightly under expected in NPR FPP for FY25. Using the narrative they provided with their resubmitted FY26 budget, this is in large part from lower than originally budgeted volumes. You can see a large offset in the other operating revenue line, that 130, almost 137% difference from the budget. This is due to the employee retention credit. So you'll see that up here in that other operating revenue line for these hospitals. And labor came in slightly over, but the largest driver is at all other operating expenses. Their income statement is, from looking at their income statement, partially due to travelers, but was more broadly bucketed in other that we don't have as much granular insight into. Expense growth has outpaced NPR as well as total operating revenue, despite the boost from the employee retention credit. On this slide, we're kind of looking at the variance against budget by payer. Brattleboro is continuing to work on improving their reporting, so there's not a ton of meaningful information at the payer level in terms of variance to drive from this, but we do want to note that the commercial was over budget by almost 5%. And moving forward, because we now have commercial NPR caps, this would trigger enforcement. Public payers came in under budget, especially Medicare at negative 13 million. And then I do want to flag, if you look at their FY24 actuals by payer, that Medicare line is incorrect. So we are working with them to improve their historical reporting, but as everyone's aware, they've had some challenges over there that they're still working through. So just wanted to flag that so we don't read into it more than we should. I'm going to pause here very quickly. So what we're going to include here is a quick year-to-date comparison. For this presentation is mostly related to their FY25 financials, but we did want to preview their FY26 results as far as we have them so far. We thought this was important to focus on this year because of the recent rate changes and the impact of Act 55 and all these the concerning financials we've seen from a lot of hospitals recently. So this is using BMH's resubmitted FY26 budget. It's much more conservative than aspirational than what we had received originally. NPR is coming in over budget currently by 3.6%. Other operating revenue significantly at 39, almost 40%. And then total operating revenue over at 3. Labor is running over budget, but non-labor is under budget, contributing to their overall operating expense being below budget by about 4%. When you factor all of this together, right? So they submitted a budget with approximately like $1.4 million in losses through Q1, $3.6 million in losses through Q1. They're doing $1.4 million in losses through Q1. Not great. We want them to have an income, but it is an improvement compared to their budget. Looking at FY25, gross revenues are up compared to budget and prior year performance. NPR is up slightly compared to budget and significantly compared to prior year performance. Other operating revenue is favorable compared to budget, about on pace with prior year, and expenses are coming in under budget. Using straight line estimates, mostly driven by non-labor expenses as labor is slightly over. So like I mentioned, they have a negative operating margin, but it's significantly smaller operating loss than budget and improved performance from Q1 of the prior year. At Brattleboro, they're again moving to their financial metrics. Days cash on hand has dropped from 100 in FY24 down to 24 in FY25. Q1 of FY26 is pretty similar, about 76. This is considered highly vulnerable. As mentioned previously, their days in AR has climbed to 131, almost 132. It's through first quarter, we see it's dropping slightly, but this is still extremely concerning. The current ratios dropped slightly to 2.6. Current assets and liabilities both increased, and funded depreciation has decreased. FY25's operating margin was negative 3.1%. They're currently at negative 4.8%. So if you look at FY25 though, for them without the employee retention credit, they're showing a negative 10% margin for the year. At Bradwood, with no known service line changes, we have not received a narrative for their FY25 yet. We have incomplete FTE information. And then looking at their quality, though, they have a CMS star rating of 3. I did want to flag that their value-based purchasing program was in the 90th percentile for FY25. We saw a smaller reduction in payment for the readmission reduction program. Moving along to CDMC, here you can see that their total operating revenue was coming in at over about 6.6. Let me go to NPR first. NPR is coming in over at 4.3%, which would trigger enforcement potentially for them. Total operating revenue at 6.6%, and operating expenses coming in over budget at 7.4%. The difference in variance against budget is contributing to their operating losses for the year of $2.4 million. Here's looking at their variances against budget. I do want to note very quickly, though, that their variance against budget by payer might be slightly overstated just to a reporting change in how they're reporting denials. Before they would report denials all in aggregate, and now it's payer specific. So it's better reporting that we're getting now, but it just might make the budget to actual variance look a little overstated. But key takeaways, commercial was over budget by $10.6 million. Again, moving forward would trigger enforcement. Public payers are close to budget, slightly over, and growth at 1.8% across payers from FY24, largely due to commercial growth, but drops in Medicare, MA, and Medicaid. Again, looking at their FY26 year to date, so their NPR is again over budget by about 3.2%, NPR FPP by 3.9%. Other operating revenue over by 87%, and total operating revenue so far 8.1% over year to date. Labor through the first quarter is running slightly over budget. Their narrative notes that this is due to overtime and over $6 million in travel or labor costs. Non-labor expenses significantly over, largely driven by pharmaceuticals, med-surg supplies, and shared service allocations. January 2026 did see significant drop in margin, though, likely due to the impact of rates coming impacting their budget. Gross revenues are up compared to both budget and prior year performance. NPR is below budget through the first third of the year, but higher than in the prior year period. Other operating revenues favorable to budget in the prior year, driven by 340B revenues and prior year. Oh my goodness, sorry. Premium incentives, cafe revenue, and restricted fund pieces. Expenses are coming in over budget using straight line estimates. They're also higher than prior year, largely due to non-labor expenses. And we see a negative operating margin year to date for them, but it is an improvement over the same period from the prior year. Looking at CDMC's metrics, their days cash on hand has dropped from about 80 in FY24 to 71 in 25. Days in AR remains right around 40. This is about average for the system. Their current ratio dropped slightly from FY24 to 1.8. Operating margin is at negative 0.6%, which is just slightly better than FY25, but worse than their FY24 performance of 1.7%. Their operating margin for 25 without the employee retention credit would be further reduced to negative $2.3 million or negative 1.4%. Looking at service lines, CDMC's had the closure of inpatient psych in January 2025, the consolidation of physician practices and outpatient rehab sites, and radiation oncology had limited service for 6 months while linear accelerator was replaced. Looking at FTEs, staff FTEs were above budget by 0.6%. Persistent traveler use, as mentioned, contributed to some labor overages. Physician clinical FTEs significantly below budget, but total paid FTEs exceeded budget. We had about $1.5 million in overage in physician salaries. Clinical to non-clinical ratio is generally in line, though, with their FY25 budget. Looking at quality quickly, their current CMS star rating is 2. Quality payments worsened slightly from FY24 to FY20. Moving along to Copley. So looking at their NPR/FPP came in at negative 1.4% below budget, but their total operating revenue came at that's about exact, just about $100,000 off of budget, so 0.1% over. Total operating expenses, however, did come in at 2% over budget, so their operating margin was only 1% versus the 2.8% they budgeted. Looking at their budget to actual variances by payer, despite their, I'll go back to the last slide real quick, but despite their NPR/FPP coming in at negative 1.4% overall, their commercial was over budget by 5% or $3 million. Again, moving forward, this will trigger enforcement. Public payers came in under budget at negative $4.6 million, and growth at about 10% across payers from FY24. We saw large increases in commercial and MA and decrease in Medicare and Medicaid. Looking at their 26 year to date, NPR is under budget by about 8.1%. Public payers are running under by 17%, negative 37% as of Q1 of 26. Commercial is running over. Other operating revenue is again well exceeding budget. They're over 147.6%. Total operating revenue is coming under at 6.9%. Operating expenses, labor is running under budget. Travelers are running over budget for the year, and non-labor budget is running over. The first quarter narrative speaks to being only over by 0.4%. Gross revenues are down significantly compared to both budget and prior year performance. NPR is also down from both budget, while last year they were running over at this point. Other operating revenue is highly favorable. From reviewing their income statement, this appears to be driven by reference lab. Right? Expenses are coming in under budget, using straight line estimates, mostly driven by labor. Prior expenses were unfavorable, driven by other operating expense. Like I said, they have a positive operating margin, but they're under budget and not as strong in that respect compared to the prior year. Looking at their financial metrics, Copley's days cash continues to drop, but it's important to note that they do hold cash at the parent company. Days AR hovers right below 60. This is below average performance system. Current ratio remains steady at around 2, so a drop in both current assets and liabilities. And then operating margin is up 1.8% year to date, which is an improvement so far over FY24 and FY25 actuals. No service line changes mentioned in the narratives we've received. There is, however, ongoing discussion related to their pre and postnatal care decisions. Looking at FTEs, their staff FTEs were below budget by 15%, offset by some additional traveler costs. Admin FTEs increased compared to budget and budgeted to increase more in FY26. And their clinical to non-clinical ratio also dropped from FY25 budget. Their current CMS star rating is 3. Moving ahead to Gifford, so they had a 1.9% operating margin. This was though their NPR FPE was negative 7.2% against budget. Their total operating revenue was well above this due to that other operating revenue coming in much higher than budgeted. In their narrative, they noted that the FY25 was the start of their multi-year turnaround plan. The budget was a bit aspirational, which you can kind of see in, like I mentioned, that negative 7.2% variance. However, they've been working with the FQHC to expand access, which has allowed some expanded inpatient capacity, and have also been focused on like EMR stabilization. What really boosted their revenues, though, as like common thread here today, is that employee retention credit. You can see in that other operating revenue, it gave them a pretty significant boost for 25. Their expenses ran over budget by 6.7% overall. Based on their narrative, about 2 million of this came from change allocation method for their shared services with some health partners. Moving forward, they've shifted to the New England Collaborative Health Network in late 25. Note savings weren't fully reflected during that fiscal year, but they are moving towards a zero-based budgeting system. Looking at their variance by payer, commercial was under budget by $7.1 million, but Medicare was also slightly under budget. Medicaid was over by almost 30%, MA by 26.1%, and growth at 9.1% across all payers from FY24, largely driven by Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, and that drop in commercial. NPR for year to date so far, NPR FPP is coming in under budget by approximately 1.2%. Commercial is running slightly under. Medicare Advantage, if you look at it in conjunction with Medicare, traditional Medicare is close to budget, and then Medicaid's running largely under budget. Total operating or other operating revenues under currently at 29.1%, and total revenues at below budget by -2%. Operating expenses in aggregate are running slightly over at 0.3%, driven by 1.9% overage in fee, salaries, and benefits, and then some offsetting savings and other operating expenses. So their operating margin is slightly under budget due to lower than budgeted revenues and budgeted expenses slightly. Gross revenues at Gifford are basically a budget. However, last year they were running significantly behind. So the improvement NPR is also down from budget, but it's an improvement from prior year. Other operating revenues down year to date, as well as compared to prior years, and expenses are only slightly lower, particularly in labor. But this is good given that their NPR is improved from prior year. Positive operating margin, negative year to date, but they've improved since last year. They're nearly at break even now. Through the first quarter, you can see that $15,000 in losses. And then looking at their financial indicators, so days cash on hand jumped in FY25 to nearly 115, but it's dropped since to 97. Both show an improvement over FY24, though largely due to additional cash and investments. Days in accounts receivable have improved from FY24 and is now considered average performing hospital, whereas before that 73 figure was concerning. Current ratios improved from FY24 to over 2, and operating margins at even though they're negative are an improvement over 24, but worse compared to FY25. Here again, you can note that the operating margin for 25, that 1.9%, without the employee retention credit would have been negative 10.9%. So again, having a pretty significant impact on Gifford's finances. No mentions of service line changes were included in their narrative. They noted that Gifford has among the highest clinical to non-clinical ratios in the state at around 85%. And their clinical to non-clinical ratio aligns with their budget. So a drop in both clinical and non-clinical FTEs kept that percentage. Their current CMS STAR rating is 4, and they're one of only 2 hospitals in Vermont that have that rating. We don't currently have any 5-star hospitals. And with that, I'll pass it along to my colleague Janelle, who's going to walk through the next batch of hospitals.
Yes, good morning. So Grace Cottage, starting right in, their operating margin came in a little bit lower than budgeted at negative 3.6%, but particularly for Grace, the total revenue over expenses was positive at $428,000. Gross revenues came in 5% below budget, while the NPR and FPP came in just shy at negative 0.4%. Looking at their narrative, utilization/patient revenue was near budget in all areas. The 2 largest variances were in physician encounters from onboarding 2 new providers during the year, and an outpatient physical therapy from having less than budgeted FTEs for part of the year. Operating expenses were over by 3.5%. The hospital did note that after their budget orders, it took some time to operationalize some cuts. So things were over in the first few months, but they were able to turn it around later in the year. And we can jump to the next slide. Just looking at payer revenues, commercial was under budget by 3.1%, and Medicaid is under budget pretty significantly at 23.7%. Medicare is over budget by 6.5%, and from 24 to 25 actuals, growth is at 2.2% across all payers, commercial outpacing the other payers a little bit here at 4.3%, Medicare at 2.2%, and then Medicaid is experiencing a drop at negative 8.9%. We're going to skip over the first quarter. We weren't able to do that for Grace. Days cash on hand. For the financial indicators, days cash on hand is pretty stable from 24 to 25 at 82 to 83. Days in accounts receivable is also stable right around 40. This is pretty average performance. The current ratio dropped slightly. There's no funded depreciation, and this is largely due to a drop in current assets. And the operating margin for 25 came in at negative 3.6%, which is an improvement from 24 at nearly negative 10%. And then our last slide for Grace, there's no service line changes. They onboarded 2 new providers during the year, and they had less than budgeted outpatient physical therapy FTEs for part of the year. Both had an impact on revenue/utilization. Clinical to non-clinical ratio and FTE counts both pretty closely aligned with the budget, and they do not currently have a CMS star rating. Jumping right into Mount Ascutney, they wrote a very thorough year-end narrative, so we have lots to speak to here. Starting with operating margin, 25 came in very close to budget at 0.8%. They note a large part of this is due to the release of COVID relief funding. Gross revenues came in right at budget. This was driven by overages in inpatient and outpatient services, offset by physician services, inpatient rehab, and swing volumes under budget. In their narrative, they speak to a drop in commercial payer mix with an uptick in Medicare and Medicaid, as well as bad debt, landing NPR at negative 3.6% below budget, with a positive offset in FPP after budgeting pretty conservatively based on what was available to them during the budget process. So overall, it comes in at negative 3.1% below budget. Other operating revenue, as you can see, came in 30% over budget. As mentioned, this is largely due to the award of COVID provider relief funds. They've been working with auditors on how to record these funds, particularly because some of them were at risk. So I believe what was recorded in 25 are funds they are certain to receive. Expenses came in 1.2% under overall. The labor expense is under due to challenges with retaining staff and labor shortages. To combat this, they said they've increased wages, and they say this will likely carry into 2026. The offset to this is the overages in contract staffing. And despite having that contract staffing number decrease year over year, they weren't able to hit budget. Jumping to their payer mix, commercial and Medicare were very close to budget. Medicaid was pretty far under budget, and Medicare Advantage was over budget by 8.6%. They're looking at 24 to 25. There's growth of 1.3% across payers. Commercial dropped 6.6%, and the remaining payers have increased between 5.4 to 8.9%. Looking at 26 year to date, they have the 1Q plus 1. They gave us the January results. NPR and FPP is running just about on budget at 0.1%. Commercial is running over, particularly in self-pay. Public players are coming in short. Other operating revenue was over at 33.8% for a combined overage of 2.5%. Operating expenses, labor is running under budget, and non-labor budget is running significantly over. Probably similar struggles to what happened in 25. And just by looking at the financials here, we can't really see any really distinct impact from Act 55 or really what's happening with rates there. This view, if we look at 25 year to date compared to budget versus 26 year to date compared to budget, gross revenues and NPR are basically at budget. The FPP is highly variable to budget for both years. Other operating revenue is favorable to budget, which is similar to prior year. Expenses are running over budget. Last year, they were running very close to budget. I do remember during the budget presentation that we thought Mount Scottney was very strong at estimating what their expenses were. Both years have ran under in labor, and currently they have a negative operating margin. Last year, year to date was positive. This year, it's mostly because expenses are running over a bit. Moving on to their financial indicators, days cash on hand remained around 220 for 24 and 25, and then 26 it's dropped. But that's still a strong number at 205. Days in accounts receivable dropped from 24 to 25. And then it looks like it's swung up a little bit in 26, putting it in the below average territory. Current ratio remains stable around 1.6 to 1.7. There's no unrestricted funded depreciation. And then operating margin is at negative 3.3% year to date. This is not as good as it was in prior years. And then jumping to the last slide from Mount Scottney, no mentions of service line changes in the narrative. There's shortfalls in FTEs compared to budget. There's in their narrative, they note continuing challenges with staffing levels and wage pressures, particularly with being a border hospital. The decrease in staffing expenses is offset by contracted labor expenses. These were still contained and decreased from the prior year. There's some decrease in FTEs also shifted to contracted positions through Dartmouth. The clinical to non-clinical ratio increased slightly from 25 budget. Both clinical and non-clinical FTE counts are down from budget. And there's no CMS star rating. Moving on to North Country. So for 25, operating margins came in favorable by 2.8%. This was largely driven by higher than budgeted NPR coupled with near budget expense management. For revenues, you'll see when we jump to the next slide, but a lot of the favorable revenues come from public payers. For Medicare, that was due to prior year cost report settlements, and for Medicaid, based on the Bridges files, they were able to improve their collection rate or reimbursement. Other operating revenues came in slightly under, mostly due to Blueprint and ACO revenue coming in short. And for expenses, labor expenses came in over budget, mostly due to benefits from high health insurance claims, followed by higher than expected locum expenses. Offsetting this, other operating expenses came in under budget in supplies, repairs and maintenance, general insurance, depreciation, and interest expense. Overall, they were able to hit a solid operating margin. Jumping to the payer revenues. Commercial was under budget by 1.6 million. DISH was also under budget. Medicare is over by 2.3 million and Medicaid is over by 2.2 million. Growth is looking at 24 to 25, growth at 5% across payers from 24. All payers increased, with the largest increase in Medicare at 14.5% and Medicaid at 7.5%, and only a small amount of growth in commercial. And jumping at the 1Q+1 financial look, volume. If we look at the volume based on gross revenues, it's pretty close to budget. NPR is pretty much at budget. Other operating revenue is under by 14.1% due to Blueprint and ACO revenue. And total operating revenue is just basically right on budget, called a little over. Operating expenses, labor is running slightly over budget and non-labor expense is over mainly due to provider taxes being significantly under budgeted. And they spoke to improving that in for future years. Margins are coming in slightly under budget due to expense overages. And then looking at performance year to date versus last year to date, gross revenues are on budget. Compared to last year, they were over budgeted. NPR is down for both budget, while last year they were running over at this point. FPP is coming in similar to last year. It's under budgeted. Other operating revenue is under budget, similar to last year, but more so. Expenses are running over. Prior years ran on budget. Labor is under, while provider tax is over. And got a negative operating margin, which is worse compared to prior years. Looking at the financial indicators, days cash on hand continues to drop, but it's still in strong standing at 186. Days in accounts receivable have seen a small reduction from 24 and 25 through January, now at 47.1, which is considered average. Current ratio dropped from 24 to 25 and strengthened slightly again to 2.1, largely due to an increase in, a decrease in current liabilities. Operating margin through January 26 is at negative 2.8%, which is worse than 25 at positive 2.8, and slightly worse than 24 at negative 2.5%. And then moving to the last slide, there's no service line changes noted. FTEs were close to budget. Benefits were over due to high health insurance claims. Locums were also over budget. Clinical to non-clinical ratio increased from the 25 budget, largely driven by the drop in non-clinical FTE count. Current CMS star rating is 2. And just a quick note, they spoke about this in the narrative, and I know that we've kept an eye on it. The EMR lawsuit is anticipated to be finalized in 2Q of 26. Jumping to NBRH, operating margin came in at negative 2%, which is under budget, mostly driven by expenses outpacing revenues, despite revenues coming in over by 1.7%. NPR was favorable due to pharmacy and the emergency department. This was offset by a drop in surgical services from the loss of 2 surgeons. FPP increased because NPRH participated in the global payment program model. This captured 98% of the Medicaid population served at NPRH as attributed lives. So it shifted almost all of Medicaid reimbursements to FPP. Looks like it had a favorable impact. Other operating revenues are favorable to budget due to a $1 million HRSA grant and pharmacy rebate. Expenses are over by 4.5%. Labor expenses close to budget. Fringe benefits are over due to health claims and workman's comp, but offset by lower than budgeted salaries. There are considerable overages and locum expense related to the loss of the 2 surgeons, as well as in primary care and the ER department. Drug expense was also over budget from some high cost infusion therapies. That's where they landed. Jumping to the payer revenues, commercial was over budget by 5.9 million. Moving forward, this would have triggered enforcement. Medicare Advantage combined with Medicare due to some adaptive reporting. This makes it look a little bit cleaner here. Public payers came in under, and growth at 3.5% across payers from 24 to 25, mostly driven by Medicaid, was under budgeted. Looking at the 1Q plus 1 results, NPR appears to be coming in slightly above budget. Commercial is coming in slightly under, Medicaid solidly over budget, followed by Medicare Advantage, and Medicare slightly over as well. Other operating revenue coming in much higher. Total operating revenue combined, it appears to be higher than budget by 2.8%. Operating expenses are running slightly over in both labor and other operating expense. And so far, they've got a solid operating margin. Looking at how they're doing this year compared to last year at this time, gross revenues are slightly under budget compared to prior year when they were slightly over. NPR is under budget, but strong compared to last year. FPP is over budget, but less so than prior year being significantly over budget. Other operating revenue is over budget. Prior year was under budget. Expenses are coming in over budget. Labor is slightly over and on pace with prior year. Overall actuals are coming in closer to budget than prior year though. And once again, nice solid operating margin, and this is an improvement over what was budgeted and prior year. Looking at their financial indicators, days cash on hand dropped from 24 at around 100 to closer to 90 for year-end 25 and 26 through January. Days in accounts receivable continue to rise from 35.7 in 24 to 45.6 in 25 and now at 47, creeping closer to average performance. Current ratio has stayed around 2.4 to 2.8 with funded depreciation. It's 1 to 1.2 without, and operating margin is 1.7 through January 26. It's an improvement over 24 at 0.1% and 25 at -2%. And moving on to the last slide, there's no changes to service lines, but they did have the loss of 2 surgeons, which impacted the surgical service line. For FTEs, locum expenses related to vacancies in surgery, primary care, and the emergency departments. Fringe benefits are over budget due to health claims and workman's comp claims. Clinical to non-clinical ratio increased from the 25 budget, largely driven by reduction in the non-clinical FTE count, and the CMS star rating is currently at 3. Okay, moving on to Northwestern. It ended the year at a 3.4% operating loss. Gross revenues were far under. This was due to inpatient and surgical, but offset by initiatives to grow revenue by capturing more market share from their service area. And they spoke to continuing this effort into 26. Overall, NPR came in at negative 0.3% under. Other operating revenues came in over budget by $2.5 million, driven by grant revenues associated with Blueprint and Community Health Team, as well as reference lab revenues. Expenses are over by $7.1 million or 5.1%. This is mostly driven by labor expense, including travelers. Workforce issues are noted as an ongoing struggle, noting competition with UVM. And other expense overages were related to unbudgeted expenses due to the surgical department, which had a mid-year interruption. Jumping down to the payer revenues, commercial was over budget by $3.6 million. Moving forward, this would trigger enforcement. Medicare and Medicaid came in under budget by 10% and 9.9%. And Medicare Advantage came in over budget by 8.6%. Growth at 5.6% across payers from FY24 to FY25. Northwestern was able to break out Medicare Advantage for 25, so it's hard to accurately measure growth in commercial. However, there was significant growth in Medicaid with a slight uptick in Medicare. And moving on to what first quarter looks like. NPR is strong at 5% over. Public payers are coming in strong based on first quarter reporting. The first quarter narrative mentions an improved collection rate. Other operating revenue is coming in strong year to date. And the total operating revenue is coming in higher than originally budgeted. And I think we'll just quickly pause and note that this is the originally approved budget. This is, I know that NMC came in with some revised with a revised budget request, and this is not based on them. So this could be a little misstated. Operating expenses are also coming in over budget, mostly driven by other operating expense. The first quarter narrative mentions travelers, and the margin is favorable to budget. However, they're still operating at a loss. Can't comment on how Act 55 is going for them yet. Looking at how they're performing year to date compared to last year to date, gross revenues are under budget, similar to last year, but last year was even more so under budget. So NPR is over budget compared to originally approved budget. Prior year was well under budget, so this is an improved performance, kind of similar to those gross revenues. Other operating revenues is coming in over budget, similar to prior year. Expenses are also over budget, primarily due to non-labor expense. I think that might be the traveler expense. Prior year actuals were coming in closer to budget. There's a negative operating margin at negative 3.4%, which is an improvement to original budget, but worse than prior year performance. Looking at their financial indicators, days cash on hand is dropping. It dropped nearly 30 days from 24 to 25, and it's dropped another 13 days. But it's still strong. Days in accounts receivable is maintained right around 47 to 49 days, which is close to below average performance. Current ratio has improved from 24 to 25 to 6.2, largely due to reductions in current liabilities. But note that there's no unrestricted funded depreciation, so no need to look at current ratio without it. Operating margin is at 3.4%, which is consistent with 25 operations and slightly worse than 24 at negative 2.5%. And moving to that last tab, there's no mention of service line changes in the narrative. Labor costs accounted for nearly 90% of variance in operating expense, which exceeded budget by $7.1 million. Clinical to non-clinical ratio dropped from the 25 budget. Their current CMS star rating is 3, and they've had some reductions in payment, mostly minor, slightly worse than 24. And that concludes NMC, and I will pass it on to Emma.
Great, thanks, Janelle. Good morning, everyone. I know everyone's really excited for me to finish up these hospitals, so I will just get right into it. Starting with Porter, looking at their income statement. We'll start with their NPR and FPP. We see that's under about negative 1.3%. They noted in their narrative that this was due to the impact of Medicare collection rates, charity care, and bad debt, and this was slightly offset by favorable denial experience. Their other operating revenue, you can see, is over by 47.5%. This is largely due to 340B revenue. I do want to note that their operating revenue is well over significantly. It's a much smaller portion of their total operating revenue. We see that for FY25 actuals, NPR and FPP is about $128 million, whereas the other operating is just under 7. So big difference there in impact, but they are significantly over. This brings their total operating revenue to over by about 0.4%, so just slightly over, pretty similar to budget. When we look at their expenses, we can see that they're slightly over in their fees, salaries, and benefits, whereas all other operating expenses are just under. So they're really coming in very close to budget with their expenses. I do want to note that their staff FTEs are below budget, but they are over on their traveler expense. And the UVM Health Network is a little different than many other hospitals. They report their travelers in with the fees, salaries, and benefits. So when we see changes in that, it can often be contributing to, or the contributing factor can be the travelers. So just wanted to note that because a lot of other hospitals don't report that way. When we look at their operating margin then, overall, they're sitting at 4.9%, which is very strong, and this continues a similar pattern. Their growth overall, if we're looking at the FY23 to 25 actual growth, I just want to point you to two numbers. Their total operating revenue on the bottom line of that first table, they're at 13.2%, whereas their total operating expense growth from 23 to 25 in that second table is at 16.5%. So we are seeing that in the last several years, their operating expense growth has outpaced their total operating revenue growth. Looking at payer specific for Porter, first main takeaway, and you can see this really clearly on the graph on the right, is that their commercials over budget by about 4.6 million or 7.4%. So again, just kind of a reminder that this moving forward would likely trigger enforcement. Medicare and Medicaid are both under budget, as you can see. And then when we look from 24 to 25 growth, we see overall at 6.1% across payers. And this is largely due to commercial and largely due to commercial growth at 25.7% because the Medicare and Medicaid has dropped. Looking at their 1Q+1 for FY26, as of 1Q, Porter was running over budget by about 1.5% in their NPR and FPP. We see here in this chart too that we see that in January really takes this negative swing and falls to 0.9% under budget. This likely could be in part at least due to the Act 55 impacts, which went into effect in January of this year. We also see Medicare's over. This is offset by a drop in Medicare Advantage, and overall they're slightly lower than their budgeted commercial amount. Their other operating revenue is over as of Q1, again, due to 340B revenue. And so their total operating revenue is essentially right on budget with that NPR under offset by their other operating revenue. And then when we look at their expenses, we see that they're over. This is largely due to traveler and premium pay expense driving those labor overages. And they also noted from their Q1Q narrative that they're over from volume-driven expenses as well. Looking then comparing their 1Q+1 from this year to last year, we see gross revenues are coming in under budget compared to being over budget in 25. Again, want to point out that this seems to be largely driven by that January performance. Their NPR this year is slightly under budget, but prior year was running slightly over budget, very close generally speaking. Their other operating revenue is running over, but not as much as the prior year. Again, largely driven by that 340B revenue. Expenses are running over slightly. Very slightly, again, similar to their prior year, very close to budget for their expenses for Porter. And they do have a positive operating margin. We see right now it's at 4.9%, but this is slightly under last year's performance and lower than budgeted. Looking at the financial indicators for Porter, their days cash on hand has improved from 24 to 138.8 in 25, though this has dropped down slightly through January at 131. Their days in AR did increase by about 4 to right under 45. It remains steady there through January of FY26, and this is average performance. Their current ratio has increased since FY24 and FY25 to 6.7 through January, 4.4 without that funded depreciation, and this seems to be largely due to drops in their current liabilities. Their operating margin remains strong, as we said in the last slide, at 4.9%. This is very comparable to their prior year experiences. And then we did just want to note here they did receive the employee retention credit, although for the Porter, it's a very small impact. Without that, they would still be at a 4.8% operating margin. Looking at service lines for Porter, noted no additions or removals to service lines in their narrative. Staff FTEs were below budget by 5.5%, but salary expenses were above. Again, this is largely due to that high traveler expense. This was offset a little bit by fringe benefits being below due to, again, those staff FTEs being below budget, which we can see on the right. The clinical to non-clinical ratio is on par with their budget. They're still sitting at around 66% clinical compared to 34% non-clinical. But there was a drop in both clinical and non-clinical FTE counts compared to budget. And Porter currently has a CMS star rating of 3. Looking at Rutland, we'll start with the NPR and FPP again. We see that they're over by about 4%. This is largely due to the recognition of CMS VDA funding. They also spoke in their narrative to a decline in custodial volume. This resulted in improved reimbursement as their custodial days were then shifted to reimbursable acute patient care days. And they also noted that they had higher than anticipated ACO settlement activity, which we can see here in this chart. Looking at their other operating revenue, this is also higher. We see it's 59.5% above budget, again, due to higher anticipated retail pharmacy activity, as well as increased 340B revenue. So this brings their total, and then we look at expenses. You see their labor is essentially on budget, but labor operating expense is slightly over budget. This is again due to pharmacy and lab expense, and they noted in their narrative that this was commensurate with an increase in volume. And then finally, if we look at their total operating revenue, FY23 to 25 growth, we see that they've grown about 10.3%. But when we compare that to their expenses have grown at just 6.4%. So not only is this a lower number than we've seen at many other hospitals for this time period, but it's also lower than their operating revenue. So they are not experiencing their operating expenses at this point, or through 23 to 25, outpacing their revenue. Looking at payer specific for Rutland and looking at this chart on the right especially, we see that commercial is over budget by a little less than $10 million. This is 5.7%, which would, again, moving forward, likely trigger enforcement. Medicare was also over budget, but Medicaid and Medicare Advantage were both under. We did want to note that Rutland received a low volume decrease adjustment of $9.48 million. So without this, when we compare their budget order amount to their actuals, they are within 1%. So I know it looks like they are over, but we'll talk about that more at the end of the presentation. And then overall, their growth is at 7.5% across payers from 24 to 25. Their commercial and Medicare largely are contributing to this growth, while MA and Medicaid have dropped. Looking at their 1Q+1 so far, their NPR is over by about 1.4%. This is due to major commercial and Medicare running over and offset somewhat by the lower than budgeted Medicaid and Medicare Advantage. Their other operating revenue is pretty substantially over, again, largely driven by those 340B revenues, specialty and outpatient pharmacy. See a lot of trends here in pharmacy being a main cause for operating revenue going over. So then their total operating revenue is very over budget at about 6.1%, again, largely driven by that other operating revenue. Their expenses are coming in over in both labor and non-labor operating expense. And I will say for Rutland, it's a little hard to determine their impact of Act 55 as of January. They don't seem to be having some of the drops that some of the other hospitals we've seen. And then overall, their operating margin is well over budget at 2.1%. Looking at their comparison of performance from Q1+1 from this year to last year, they're above budget, which is an improvement to last year when gross revenues fell well below their budget. Their NPR is coming in above budget to a greater extent than the prior year, and their other operating revenue is also up significantly, again, compared to budget and to a greater extent than prior year. So that same trend is happening in NPR and other operating. Their expenses then are over budget. This is driven both by labor and non-labor, whereas prior year they were over budget in non-labor, but they were actually under budget in labor. So a little bit of a different trend here so far. Again, they have a positive operating margin right now, 1.4%, an improvement over budget, which was at negative 1.4%, but worse performance compared to prior year. Looking at their financial indicators, their days cash on hand remains very strong, around 250. Their days in AR has increased slightly since 24 and 25 to 40.1, but this is still an average performance and no major concerns there. Their current ratio has continued to increase. This is again due to increases kind of at all angles of this equation. They've increased their current assets and unrestricted funded depreciation, generally speaking, and their current liabilities have continued to drop. And so their operating margin is currently positive at 1.4% through January of FY26, which is an improvement over 24, worse performance than 25, so kind of falling right in the middle there. And looking at service lines, Rutland noted no changes to their service lines. For FTEs, they did note that their physician salaries exceeded budget by $1.6 million. This is largely due to needing locum and per diem coverage, as they had some leaves of absence as well as some staffing shortages. Fringe benefits was below budget, so that helped offset this slightly due to lower than anticipated claim activity. And then if we look at that chart in the top right, clinical to non-clinical ratio, we do see that it dropped slightly from the 25 budget. Both counts of clinical and non-clinical FTEs are down, so their ratio is sitting right now at about 60% clinical, 40% non-clinical. Rutland's current CMS star rating is at 1, and their overall quality appears to have worsened between 24 and 25, but I do want to know this is not new. We mentioned this during the budget season that Rutland was at 1. This hasn't changed, and so any efforts that Rutland may have implemented since this time won't be reflected in this, and so we'll like to continue to monitor this quality concern at Rutland. Moving on to SVMC, looking at their income statement, we start with the NPR and FPP. we see that that is under budget slightly by 1.4%, and their other operating revenue is above by about 53.2%. This is higher due to 340B revenue. They also had a one-time 2010 CMS volume decrease adjustment, which was $5.2 million. So that's, you could see a pretty large chunk as they went from 14.9 to $22.9 million. About 5 million of that is contributed to that one-time payment. Looking at their total operating revenue, then they're over slightly by 2.2%. Their expenses year to date for FY25 are 6.2% over for labor expense. Non-labor is under, which kind of balances that total operating expense out to 2.5% over budget. So as a result of those variances, the operating margin is 1.3%, which is an improvement from 24, but didn't quite hit that budgeted amount that they wanted to. Their total operating revenue growth from 23 to 25 is at 17.2%, whereas their total operating expense growth at the same time is 11.4%. So again, we're seeing an 11.4% growth, but it's a smaller growth than their operating revenue. So they're not experiencing, at least from this time period, that operating expenses are exceeding their revenues. Looking at their payer, commercial is under budget by about 4.3 million, as you can see. The only one on the right that you can see payers that are over budget is Medicare at about $8.7 million. And then looking from 24 to 25, there's growth at 2.8% across all payers. There are some issues with the reporting anomaly, which skews the 24 data. And so we can't really read into those individual line items for growth, but overall growth is at about 2.8%. Looking at 1Q+1 for SVMC, they're just slightly under budget, essentially on budget at negative 0.3%. In their narrative for the 1Q, they noted that this was due to shift in volumes from Medicaid to Medicare and commercial. Their commercial NPR is coming in over budget, whereas MA and Medicare are under, and Medicaid is about flat. When we look at their other operating revenue, again, over 112% right now. This is largely due to 340B as well as some additional COVID stimulus checks, is what they noted in their narrative. When we look at their total operating revenue, then largely due to this other operating revenue, they are over about 5.4% year to date. Looking at their expenses, this variance is driven by higher 340B costs as well as administrative expenses, as we can see that their labor expense is actually under budget right now, whereas it's that other operating expense that is growing. And so that's what they noted in their narrative as to drivers of that. Gross revenues are over budget and they are up significantly compared to their prior year, whereas their NPR is under budget, but it's still up from the prior year. When you look at it, including FPP, you could see that they're essentially on budget. Their other operating revenue is significantly over budget. Compared to last year, they were only really slightly over budget. Again, noted in the prior slide that this is largely due to 340B and those stimulus checks. Their expenses are coming in over just slightly. Labor is under and non-labor is over, which is a reversal of what was the prior year. And so it seems like there's some shifting going on. And then there's a positive operating margin at 2.2%, which is a pretty large improvement over the budget as well as their prior year. Looking at their financial indicators, their days cash on hand continues to drop. However, it's important to note that SVMC does hold cash at the parent company, so we're not overly concerned with this low days cash on hand for SVMC. That's anticipated. Their days in AR has increased from 24 to around 45 through 25 and 26 through January. So this is still considered average performance. Their current ratio is stable, but it's low. It's less than 1, which is break even with or without funded depreciation. And their operating margin, again, 2.2%. This is an improvement over FY24 and FY25. However, if we look at the FY25 operating margin at 1.3%, they did receive an employee retention credit. Similarly to Porter, it doesn't make a huge impact on their margin. This would have dropped them to about 1.2% margin. And looking at some service line changes for SVMC, there were no reductions. I want to make that really clear, but there were some transitions. So radiology transitioned from a private entity to the hospital. Bennington's private radiology practice closed, so SVMC just had to transition that into a hospital-owned service. So nothing new, just a transition, and that began in FY25. When we look at bariatric surgery cases, this was also introduced as a new service in the FY26 budget, but it began in late 25. So just an addition and a kind of change, no reductions here. When we look at FTEs, we do note a large positive variance in salaries and wages. This is due they noted in their narrative that this was due in large part to restructuring many administrative positions, as well as some benefit changes. And then their clinical to non-clinical ratio in that top right, we see aligns with budget, 75% clinical, 25% non-clinical. Their current CMS star rating is 4. Again, they are the other hospital that has a 4-star rating, no 5 stars currently. And while their VBP program adjustment went from positive to a negative, they now also no longer have a reduction in their age for their hospital acquired condition reduction program. So overall, seeing no major huge swings in quality for SVMC. Looking at Springfield, we start with their NPR and their FPP. We see that they're just slightly under budget, essentially on. Their other operating revenue is significantly higher at 605.4% over budget, which brings their total operating revenue to 8.2% over. When we compare that to expenses, however, they ran hot for FY25 in both labor and non-labor expense to bring their total operating expense over budget by 9.1%. And then that led to their operating margin being about 0.7%, which is a reduction to budget, which was budgeted at 1.5. Looking at their 23 to their 25 growth, total operating revenue grew 18.9%, whereas total operating expense grew 17% in that same time period. So pretty close. Technically, revenues are still outpacing expenses. And again, some of this expense growth could be due to additional volume, right? And so that's just to be clear, that could be a factor in here. Looking at first quarter of 26 for Springfield, their NPR is over 1.3%. Looking at gross revenues, it looks like this is largely driven by increased volume. Their other operating revenues over 18.9%, which leaves their total operating revenue over by about 1.5%. When we look at their operating expenses, their labor is actually currently running slightly under, but their non-labor expense is over, which is causing total operating expenses to be over budget by 5.2%. And a large driver of this is the traveler expense. Their gross revenues are coming in higher than budget. Their prior year was a little bit closer to budget. However, NPR is on budget, which is an improvement from the prior year when they were well below their NPR budget at this point. Other operating revenue is coming in slightly over budget. It's pretty similar to what they experienced prior year at this time. And expenses are over budget to a greater extent than the prior year. Their negative operating margins at negative 3.8%, which is worse than they budgeted and their prior year. Looking at some financial indicators for Springfield, we do see that days cash on hand increased from 24 to 25 by over 12 days. However, that has since dropped back down to 45 through the first quarter of 26. So, Springfield continues to be in a highly vulnerable cash position. Days in AR remains very high, as Matt noted at the beginning of the presentation. This has improved from 24 and 25 down to around 74, but we'd really like to see this continue to drop, and it is well below average performance. Current ratio is improved from 24. It remains consistent right around 2. And we'll just note here again that they do not have any unrestricted funded depreciation noted in their budget. Their operating margin, as we mentioned in the last slide, is negative 3.8% through the first quarter, which again is worse than FY24 and FY25. Springfield's another hospital that received an employee retention credit. They received $5.6 million, and it is a very impactful amount. We could see that their FY25 budget with it was 0.7%. Without it, they would drop to almost negative 8%. So a huge swing for them for that employee retention credit. Finally, I'm just going to note that Springfield's requested an extension to March 20th to submit some required actuals information. So this slide's a little sparse, but we haven't received a narrative from Springfield, so we're unaware of any service line changes. Their clinical to non-clinical ratio has dropped from budget. This seems like to be largely due to clinical FTEs dropping. So they're currently at 52% clinical, 48% non-clinical. Their quality currently, their CMS star ratings at 2. Finally, for UVM, I'll start with their NPR and FPP. It's over by about 2.3%. They did note that volumes were running high compared to budget by all payers. They noted in their narrative that this was driven by ED visits, admissions and discharges, radiology, cardiology, and OR cases. They did also note that the length of stay exceeded budget for the year, but they had some efforts in place in discharges of long-term patients that improved their average daily census significantly by the end of the year. When we look at their other operating revenues, these were over budget, driven largely by specialty, contract, and mail order pharmacy, as well as they did receive the employee retention credit and also some additional grant revenue. They actually had a 340B revenue being under budget, so this was an offset to some of these increases of about $23.5 million. When we look at expenses, salary expenses came in over, and overall labor expenses were 4.2% over. The physician salaries came in under 4.2 budget, under $4.2 million under budget. However, this was completely offset by locums, which came in 5.7 million over. However, we did want to note that travelers were just barely over budget at less than $1 million according to their Bridges file. So it does seem like they were able to manage their traveler expense this year. Non-salary expense largely driven by pharmacy and pharmaceuticals for a total of over $50 million. Some smaller contributors to this were still but what were still impactful include med-surg supplies, funding non-hospital primary care providers from the settlement, as well as some grants. And so overall, this has led them to a 1.3% operating margin. And we did want to note too that the total operating revenue growth from 23 to 25 is at 17%, whereas their total operating expense growth from that same time period is at 19.1%. So UVM is an example of a hospital that their growth in this time has exceeded their revenues, and their growth in expenses has exceeded their revenues. Looking at payer specific revenue for UVM, their commercial is over by just under $50 million, which is 4.5%. And so again, noting that moving forward, this would likely trigger enforcement. Medicare and Medicaid are both under budget. And when we look from 24 to 25, growth at 2.1% across payers. Again, this seems largely due to commercial and MA, as Medicare and Medicaid have both decreased. Their NPR and FPP is over year to date by 1.7%. And the narrative noted that this was driven by commercial and Medicaid and offset some by Medicare and Medicare Advantage. Their other operating revenue is significantly over. This is driven by retail pharmacy demand, according to their first quarter narrative. And so overall, their total operating revenue is over by 5.2%, again, largely driven by this other operating revenue. Looking at their operating expenses, labor expense was close to budget due to lower health insurance claims than they anticipated. Their non-labor is over budget due to, again, retail pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, their med-surg supplies, as well as mental health investments and efficiency initiatives. And so overall, their operating margin significantly drops for January, and this could largely, again, be due to, at least in some part, the Act 55 impacts, as well as overages and expenses. Gross revenues currently are under budget compared to their prior year being over budget. Overall, the gross revenues are down from the prior year at this time. Their NPR is slightly under budget, but it's very close to the prior year amount. And so we're seeing essentially flat NPR growth from this time this year, end of January, to this time last year in FY25. Other operating revenue is under budget compared to the prior year. It was over budget compared to prior year being under budget, and expenses are, again, as we noted, over budget. Labor's over, but to a smaller degree than prior years. The bigger impact here is really that non-labor expense, significantly over budget, again, due to the many factors we've noted, largely pharmaceuticals. So all of this has led them to have currently a negative operating margin at -1% through January of FY26. This is worse than they have budgeted and worse than this time in the prior year. Looking at financial indicators for UVM, days cash on hand has increased slightly from 24, remains right around mid 140. Days in AR has increased in FY25 and through 26. It's now at 52.1%, which is technically considered below average performance. So we'd like to see that drop back down. Current ratio continues to increase and is at 4.5 through January of FY26, or 2.7 without funded depreciation. Again, operating margins at -1%, which is worse than 24 and 25. UVM kind of has a moderate impact of the employee retention credit. They received $12.6 million. So current with the employee retention credit, they're at 1.3% margin. Without it, they're at 0.8%. So not as big of an impact as some of the other hospitals, but more than a 0.1% impact. Looking at service lines, no changes to service lines were noted. They did note in their narrative that they absorbed those CVHO patients, which was dealing with the Schedule A that they submitted with their FY26 budget. Their staff FTEs came in 1.3% over budget, which was a main driver of the $19.8 million salary overage, along with some sign-on bonuses. Their clinical to non-clinical ratio has decreased very slightly from FY25 budget, essentially on, but the clinical FTEs are under budget while their non-clinical FTEs are over budget. So that's what's contributing to that change. And so their FTE ratio is about 65% clinical, 35% non-clinical. Looking at their quality, their current CMS star rating is 3. Generally speaking, there's no major changes in quality-based payment adjustments from 24 to 25. So with that, I will pass it back to Matt to discuss a couple things on enforcement for this year.
Thanks, Emma. So typically at the end of these actual presentations, we just review the hospitals that exceeded their NPR caps and briefly discuss the next step. So 4 hospitals technically exceeded their revenue caps in FY25, which as a reminder for everybody is a 1% variance from their NPR cap. Those are CVMC, North Country, Rutland, and UVM Medical Center. I do want to note that for Rutland and UVM Medical Center, they've submitted notice to or submitted information to us suggesting that they're not subject to enforcement. In Rutland's case, this is part of the previous settlement agreement. There was a low volume adjustment from CVS to not be counted as part of their NPR for enforcement. And then at the medical center, they're not subject after you apply, and potentially not subject to after you apply an adjustment based on the provider transfer that I just mentioned. So just looking at the raw numbers here against their budget orders, you can see CVMC was 12.5 million over, North Country 1.8, Rutland 11 million, and UVMMC 23.5. So in total, against budget orders, NPR was below the 1% threshold system wide, but in a handful of cases did exceed the cap. So the next step is staff will be reviewing and determining which hospital will be notified of potential enforcement, and we'll submit letters to them and, if necessary, schedule a hearing. Chair Foster, that is all we have for 25 actuals presentations. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much to you and your team. I have a few questions. I'll let the other board members start. So if any board members have comments or questions, the floor is yours.
I can go first if that's all right. I just have, thanks for the presentation. It's a lot of work. It's very dense. Kept it interesting. So thank you for that. I just have one question, I think, that sort of relates to all of them together, which is when looking at the clinical to non-clinical FTE ratios, I'm trying to understand 2 things. One is the impact of travelers on that ratio, if travelers are counted as clinical or non-clinical, given that sometimes they're counted as labor and sometimes they're counted as other, and the impact of a hospital that's part of a network, like and uses shared services, if the shared services FTE are included in the clinical non-clinical calculations.
Yeah, I will, Dave, we'll get back to you with an answer for that. I want to make sure it's
great.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I just sort of say my general common thread, although not universal, there are some hospitals that this doesn't apply to, but is that it, to me, when I look through these, it's a continued trend of expense growth outpacing revenue growth, and the expense growth appears high compared to other measures of economic growth. So that's sort of just a generalization of, I think, a take home of these, which I feel is concerning. Thanks.
This is Sarah. I have one very quick question about the 2026 data. That's only 1 month, correct? So it's pretty hard to tell what's going on with that tiny amount of information.
We have, so it's FY26. So we have the first quarter is October, November, December, and then we do have January actuals in there. Why we're trying to include the first quarter plus that 1 month is that in most cases, hospital rate, the impact of hospital rate decisions are felt in January. So it gave us a little bit of, it's 1 month, as you mentioned, but it gives us a little bit of insight into the impact of that on their finances.
Okay, just to further clarify, two other things. Are there trends that we can see in the way care is delivered? Like, I think, at least in the commercial market, sometimes a lot of care happens at the end of the year versus the beginning of the year. And, you know, how do you view that when you're looking at this data? And then in January, if the rate changed January 1st, I think, for most of these, is there a lag because they're not billing on January 1st? I think most of them bill at the end of the week. So are you getting 3 months worth of billing changes versus 3 weeks versus 4? I'm just curious about the way it works.
I don't know on the last question, but we can get more information. And then I apologize. The first question I did have an answer for, but it's slipped my mind. All right, so
It was about seasonality in the claims.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So in the past, so the seasonality comparing against budget is a little bit trickier because we don't require them to submit monthly budgets. In some cases, hospitals do, which makes the budget actual comparison a little cleaner there. So I think we've noted on the slides where we're using like straight line averages for comparison purposes. We did change the reporting last year. So we do have monthly actuals for all of the hospitals in the same format that we received their budget information in. So we're able to do ongoing like year to date versus prior year actuals at a closer like month, like less of those sorts of straight line averages involved. So yeah, we are making improvements to try to increase that. But we didn't require hospitals to submit monthly budgets. MIC came off.
Yeah, Matt, I'll just say one thing, that most hospitals actually do negotiate in, like, their rates go in October. The Health Network, UVM Health Network, their rates go in January 1, and I believe there's 1 or 2 other hospitals that go in January 1, but the majority actually will see the full rate impact from October on, and so we'll get more of that. January, we were hopeful that we'd be able to see some level of Act 55 and those rate impacts for the hospitals that do negotiate. So I just wanted to clarify that most of them actually do negotiate and have their rates go into effect October 1.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I appreciate it.
I'll jump in. This is Tom. Thank you for all the work that goes into this. It's incredibly detailed and dense. I too noted the growth in operating expense, and it appears that early on in the slides, the overall trend for the whole system has been large growth in operating expense and exceeding revenue growth. And I just wanted to double check and make sure that I was reading that correctly. That you guys have, I think it was around slide 5.
Yeah, on this one, Tom, you can see, if you see the FY23 to 25 actuals growth there, the OpEx at 15.5%. So it's growing slightly slower than that 16% over that same period in total operating revenue.
Right.
But that's a system-wide, right? So individual hospitals have very different experiences here.
Exactly. And could you check slide 5 for a second?
Yeah.
Was this, I think, was where I was the 8.5 compared to 7.9. Over a longer horizon like that looks like more of a. Would you consider that, Matt, more of a structural problem or a temporary concern?
Structural.
And it seems like there are several possible directions that an organization could take if its particular operating expenses were greater than revenue. One that we hear often is service line reductions, but operating expense is not just clinical expense, correct? Right. Okay. Sorry about my throat. With the, we have kind of a blunt breakdown of clinical versus non-clinical. Are there, do you know of, or could we possibly look into breaking that down further into direct patient care labor versus management administration labor or overhead labor. I think those are other common variables that we hear.
Yeah, Tom. So you can find it in our metrics inventory, but we're anticipating leveraging the cost report data, especially on some of the expense reporting, a lot more in the hospital budget process to give us more insight into some of these growth. Yeah.
That'd be excellent. It seems like there may be other possibilities other than service line reductions to decrease operating expense. So it'd be helpful to explore that. Thank you very much. Pardon my voice.
So thank you so much, everybody. This is the team. You guys did an amazing job here. This is the most thorough I think we've ever had of an actuals presentation in the 12 years I've been here. So really, really helpful. I just actually have 3 comments I think I want to make. One is it would be helpful at some point maybe for us to really do a deeper dive into the other operating revenue. There's some wild swings that we're seeing in here. And, some of it's coming from these, employee retention, grants or, that we got from COVID. But I also think that we really need to start to understand the retail pharmacy growth, the reference labs. Is it price that's growing? Is it utilization that's growing? There's just a lot going on here. And I think it'd be really helpful for us to dig in a little bit to try and understand that. So I'm just going to kind of put a placeholder in that. It would be helpful, I think, at some point between now and our budget season to really start to understand that a little bit more. I would also say, as I'm looking at some of these days cash on hand and current ratios, I know we're also gathering some information on corporate structure and parent companies and where assets and cash are living. And I think it might be helpful to add a column to, this reporting that has some consolidated measures in there. So really understanding what is accessible to these hospitals and what is, held up at the parent company that may be accessible as well. So I would just ask that maybe we think about that a little bit. That might be really helpful. And then the last comment I would make is around quality. I have some, growing concerns. They started last year in the budget season, and they are still here today. And as we think about the growth in locums and the growth in travelers that we heard today in this presentation, one of the things that we learned last year in the hospital budget process is that one of the drivers of some of the fall in quality ratings has been the growth in travelers and locums. At least that was what was shared with us during the hospital budgets. And so I worry, and I worry that we don't really have enough time during the hospital budget hearings to do a deep dive into quality. So one thing I was just going to suggest and throw out there for other board members to consider is, as we're seeing these serious reportable events rising, as we're seeing these quality ratings falling, should we carve out some time perhaps in June to maybe do a deeper dive into quality and looking at what's happening in our healthcare system in anticipation of a budget season where we may not have as much time to do the deep dive that I think we may need. So I'm just those are sort of 3 kind of general overall comments, but I really want to say thank you, and I look forward to, I'm going to do a little deeper dive myself into some of these financials, hospital specific, but this has been really helpful.
Thanks. And echoing Member Holmes, every year this has gotten better and better and better, and this is definitely the best presentation we've had on actuals. And this team is really solid and really stable, and I really, really appreciate what you're all doing. Echoing Member Holmes on the quality, I think maybe we've had VPQHC come in the past. I think that was largely anonymized, so we couldn't really use it to maybe drive the change or understand particular areas of concern and issue. Maybe we discuss and address it there. Maybe we have the hospitals come in as a separate hearing, or maybe make the actual budget presentations have more of a focus from the hospitals on the quality issues that we've seen arise. Only comment I had, also Member Holmes cited the concern about the parent company money. Definitely on the slides with the days cash on hand, we want to make sure we put an asterisk on the ones, Copley, UVM, SVMC at least, that have significant assets elsewhere, just so it's apples to apples. Copley, I recall, had over 100 days cash on hand at the parent entity when we made a mid-year adjustment to give them more rate, which to my knowledge, I don't think I knew. So we definitely want to make sure that that number is fully represented. And then the last comment is just people have cited this slides 4 and 5. That was the one I noted as well. My question is really, it's interesting to see the flattening of this, which I think is what we want. That is consistent with our health policy goals in this state for the last 10 plus years. We want growth that's affordable, as Member Walsh and Merman mentioned. My question really is sort of more of a rhetorical one and something we need to think about more broadly with our reference-based pricing work and our long-term strategy. What do we want this to look like in 2030 and in 2031? Because I think we go year to year and we kind of deal with the things in front of us, but we're not really thinking, are we achieving the state's long-term strategies? And we do know that we want to move care out of hospitals to more appropriate, affordable, high-quality settings. We do know there's a challenge in getting it there, but I think we do need to set the targets for where we want this to be. The all-payer model had it. That was very, very flawed in that it looked at an all-payer basis, and then we didn't achieve it anyway. Not by a large margin. It really did kind of push on the cost shift a little bit by having that all-payer target. So I think just broadly thinking about our health policy, we do really want to focus on what these numbers look like 5 years down the road and how are we going to get there and give the hospitals a roadmap on how to get there with AHS and the transformation. I have no other comment. Thank you all. I'm really excited for a great budget season and your outstanding work this coming summer. Any comment from the healthcare advocate?
Sure. Sorry, I'm shutting my blinds really quickly, so I'm not quite as washed out. So just 3 comments. One is, I think Matt, I think everyone, I think from the early days of operating revenue for UVM might actually be higher than it's indicated, because at least when I looked at like 5 years of 990 data compared to peers of the amount of unreimbursed Medicaid booked, UVM was substantially higher than peers, and at least 1 year using professional services as a proxy for inpatient and outpatient, Vermont had some of the highest Medicaid reimbursement rates in the country. So if folks want to look at that, and it's by hospital type, looking at 5 years of 990 data, it is, I think it was sent to the board. It's also available if you Google HCA and policy papers, whatever comes up that was written in 2025. So I was wondering, Matt, if you were seeing any, or the hospital budget team, if you were seeing changes in the ratio of free care to bad debt kind of starting when the new free care bill was implemented. So what, I guess that would be 2024-ish, halfway through that, and in 2025, like if we're seeing kind of any of the kind of canary in the coal mine.
Emma, Janelle, correct me if I'm misspeaking, but I think we haven't really seen it necessarily in the data yet. Not like in a way, but we've heard anecdotally from hospitals to kind of expect this. So we're anticipating seeing it very, very soon. Is that?
No, that's helpful. That kind of, it's interesting because at least I talked to one hospital, and I think I'll probably visit that hospital. They were not seeing increased uptick.
Yeah.
And it was really unclear why, because, in terms of plain language and marketing, everything, they were probably one of the best or most accessible free care materials in the state. So I'm trying to figure that out. And I'm also kind of curious what you think if we'll see kind of leading indicators perhaps of the loss of like what it means to hospital revenues with the ending of enhanced premium tax credits and where that would show up. Like, would it show up in bad debt, days in account receivable? Like,
Yeah, you kind of anticipated where I was going to respond. I think it's going to be important. We're going to really have to figure out what's driving some of these increases. Like you just mentioned, I would expect to see bad debt increase or accounts receivable increase, but kind of breaking out there's multiple variables here driving this. So kind of understanding and unpacking what's causing what I think is going to be obviously important, but tricky. And I think we're going to have to reach out to hospitals, honestly, to understand their individual experiences here. Because we have heard kind of anecdotally what you described, but then yeah, like some hospitals not experiencing that. So just understanding like what it is about their payer mix, their patient mix, their hospital operations that might be driving that. But it's definitely on our radar for sure.
and I've just been thinking about, I mean, that's wonderful of talking to the hospitals to try to unpack it. I think, it might be helpful to have kind of like a standardized like method for approaching hospitals on this. Like, what questions do we ask hospitals to unpack it so we get similar answers and that's comparable? Like that whole process of, learning from this different source of data from kind of hospitals' experiences is something that I think we have to grapple with as a state. And once we get these kind of we want these more nuanced understandings. Yeah. So those are my only questions, Chair. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schultheis. I'll open up to public comment. Okay, hearing none, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 12:26, and we've noticed a potential executive session. I'll bring that up when we come back. So for the public, I do anticipate we will go into executive session. I do not anticipate we'll have any substance when we come back, so you're welcome to wait, but I presume there's going to be no other substance after the executive session. All right, thank you. We'll take a 5-minute break. Oh, sorry, Hillary?
Sorry, I couldn't find the button quick enough, but I wanted to go back to Member Holmes's concerns around quality and doing a deep dive. We're always happy to support discussions around quality and contribute however we can. But just to note that the new CMS star ratings are going to be released at the end of the summer. So it might make sense to wait on that deep dive because those ratings are going to change. But
Great.
please reach out if there's any way that we can support those discussions.
Thank you. We will. And thank you for, you've presented to us a number of times, and a number of your decks have had a lot of impact and raised awareness for us on a number of issues. So thanks for being available, and we'll probably reach out and see if there's a way we can work with you again to help trying to continue to improve quality here. Okay, we'll take a quick 5-minute recess. Okay, it looks like everyone's back. The staff presented a couple weeks ago now on a potential benchmark relating to out-of-state loans from UVM Medical Center to the UVM Health's New York hospitals, and the recommendation was a benchmark to lower UVM's prices to effectively be paid back. This was an issue that's come up a couple different budget years now, budget cycles, and I think the board is essentially trying to find a solution, and that was one the staff proposed. UVM has raised some objections to it, one of which is legal. And so I wanted to provide the board an opportunity to get counsel from our excellent attorney, Mark Hengsler, and Mr. Barber on that issue. So I move to make a finding that premature general public knowledge of confidential attorney-client communications would clearly place the board at a substantial disadvantage.
Second.
All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Aye. And the motion carries. I have a second motion, which is I move that we enter into executive session pursuant to 1 VSA 313A1F for the purpose of seeking counsel from GMCB's staff attorney. Attendance at the executive session will include the board members, our lawyers, and any necessary GMCB staff.
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. And the motion carries. So we'll recess this hearing and we will go to an executive session. I anticipate we'll be done in 30 to 45 minutes, and we'll come back to this around 1:15, and we'll notice if we're going to be longer. So we can take a recess. Thank you. Looks like everyone's back. We can resume the Care Board's hearing of March 18th. Is there any old or new business for the board? Any other public comment? Seeing none, I move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I
Aye.
Aye, and we're adjourned. Thank you.